Case 1. Kristel Candelario. June 2023, Cuyahoga County Court. It started with a welfare check. On June 16, 2023, police officers arrived at a home in Cleveland, Ohio, responding to concerns from relatives who hadn't heard from Kristel Candelario or seen her 16-month-old daughter, Jalen, in over a week. What officers discovered inside that home would become one of the most disturbing child neglect cases in Ohio history. The front door was locked. Officers knocked repeatedly, calling out, but received no response. With authorization, they entered the residence. The smell hit them immediately, a combination of decay, waste, and death that veteran officers would later describe as overwhelming. They found little Jalen in her playpen, deceased, her tiny body severely dehydrated and emaciated. The toddler had been alone for 10 days. Investigators quickly pieced together a timeline that defied comprehension. Kristel Candelario, a 31-year-old mother, had left her daughter alone in their home on June 6 while she traveled to Detroit and Puerto Rico for vacation. Security footage and digital records confirmed she spent those 10 days enjoying restaurants, beaches, and tourist attractions while her baby slowly died of starvation and dehydration just a few hundred miles away. The autopsy revealed devastating details. Jalen died from severe dehydration and malnutrition. Her diaper, unchanged for days, had caused extensive sores and infections. The playpen where she spent her final days contained minimal food and water, none of which a 16-month-old could access independently. Medical examiners estimated the child suffered for at least a week before death mercifully claimed her. When Candelario returned home on June 16th, she discovered her daughter's body and called 911. In the recorded call, she claimed she had only been gone a few days and didn't know what happened. But digital evidence and witness statements quickly dismantled her lies. Text messages revealed she had been planning the trip for weeks. Surveillance footage from her apartment complex showed her leaving with luggage on June 6th. Credit card records, social media posts, and travel confirmations placed her hundreds of miles away for the entire 10-day period. She had posted photos of herself smiling at beaches and restaurants while her daughter lay dying. Perhaps most chilling was what investigators found on her phone. Searches about the effects of leaving a child alone and how long children could survive without food or water. Candelario had researched the very crime she was committing, suggesting premeditation and full awareness of the consequences. The evidence was overwhelming. Candelario was arrested and charged with aggravated murder and child endangerment. Faced with irrefutable proof, she eventually pleaded guilty to all charges. During court proceedings, prosecutors presented a portrait of a mother who valued her own pleasure over her child's life. Witnesses testified that Candelario had complained about the burden of motherhood and expressed desire for freedom. She had actively chosen vacation over her daughter's survival. The community was devastated. Neighbors reported they had seen Jalen playing outside just days before she died, a happy, healthy toddler with her whole life ahead of her. Now she was gone, and her mother was solely responsible. On March 18, 2024, Judge Brendan Sheehan sentenced Kristel Candelario to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In his sentencing remarks, the judge stated, "The bond between mother and child is the most sacred bond that exists. You shattered that bond in the most egregious way possible." Candelario showed minimal emotion during sentencing. The courtroom, however, was filled with tears from family members, child advocates, and community members who came to bear witness to justice for little Jalen. This case sparked conversations across Ohio about mandatory reporting, welfare checks, and support systems for struggling parents. But no policy changes can bring back 16-month-old Jalen Candelario, a beautiful child who died alone, terrified, and in pain while her mother enjoyed a vacation. If you suspect a child is being neglected or abused, please contact local authorities immediately. Your call could save a life. Don't wait. Don't assume someone else will help. Be the person who speaks up for a child who cannot speak for themselves. Case 2, China Arnold, August 2005, Montgomery County Court. The call came in just after noon on August 29, 2005. A frantic woman reported her infant daughter wasn't breathing at their Dayton, Ohio apartment. Paramedics rushed to the scene, but nothing could prepare them for what they would discover. 26-year-old China Arnold claimed she had put her 4-week-old daughter, Paris Talley, down for a nap the previous evening and found her unresponsive the next morning. But when medical examiners performed the autopsy, they uncovered injuries so unusual, so horrific, that it took extensive investigation to understand what had happened. Baby Paris had been cooked from the inside out. The medical examiner noted severe thermal injuries inconsistent with any natural cause or typical accident. The infant's internal organs showed heat damage. Her body temperature and tissue breakdown suggested exposure to extreme, concentrated heat. After consulting with specialists and conducting unprecedented forensic analysis, investigators reached a shocking conclusion. Someone had placed the baby in a microwave oven. This revelation sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community. Infanticide by microwave was almost unheard of, with only a handful of similar cases documented worldwide. The brutality was incomprehensible, the suffering unimaginable. Investigators turned their focus to China Arnold. Initially, she maintained her story that Paris had simply stopped breathing. But as forensic evidence mounted, inconsistencies in her account became apparent. She had been drinking heavily the night before. Witnesses reported hearing arguing and a baby crying. Arnold's boyfriend mentioned that China had been angry about the baby's paternity. The case took a complex turn when Arnold's boyfriend initially confessed to the crime, claiming he had acted alone. However, investigators believe this was a false confession meant to protect Arnold. The boyfriend later recanted, and evidence increasingly pointed to China Arnold as the perpetrator. During investigation, a disturbing picture emerged. Arnold had been drinking at a bar on the evening of August 20th. She returned home intoxicated and got into an argument with her boyfriend about whether he was Paris's biological father. Neighbors reported hearing a baby crying intensely, then sudden silence. Prosecutors theorized that in a fit of rage, fueled by alcohol and anger, Arnold placed her 1-month-old daughter into the microwave and turned it on. The duration remains unclear, but medical evidence suggested the child was exposed to microwave radiation long enough to cause fatal internal injuries. The trial became a media sensation. The very notion of the crime, a mother microwaving her infant, was so disturbing that many people initially refused to believe it was possible. Defense attorneys argued the evidence was circumstantial and that the cause of death couldn't be definitively proven. But prosecutors presented expert testimony from medical examiners, physicists, and forensic specialists who explained exactly how microwave radiation causes specific patterns of internal injury. Baby Paris's injuries matched these patterns precisely. There was no other plausible explanation. The trial ended in conviction, but legal proceedings would continue for years. Arnold was convicted of aggravated murder in 2007 and sentenced to life in prison without parole. However, appeals and retrials followed due to various legal technicalities and questions about witness credibility. In 2011, a retrial resulted in another guilty verdict. Once again, China Arnold was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. The jury heard all the evidence, saw the medical reports, and reached the same conclusion. She had deliberately killed her daughter in one of the most cruel methods imaginable. Throughout the trials, Arnold maintained her innocence, claiming she would never hurt her child. But the forensic evidence was irrefutable. Baby Paris died from thermal injuries consistent only with microwave radiation exposure, and Arnold was the only person with access to the child that night. The case of Paris Talley led to increased awareness about substance abuse, domestic violence, and the vulnerabilities of infants in unstable households. Child welfare organizations used this tragedy to push for better support systems for new mothers, particularly those struggling with addiction or mental health issues. But for little Paris Talley, born on July 31, 2005, and murdered just 29 days later, no advocacy or policy change can undo what was done. She never experienced her first smile, her first laugh, her first steps. She knew only 4 weeks of life before experiencing a death too horrific to fully comprehend. Today, China Arnold remains incarcerated, serving life without parole. The case continues to be studied in forensic science and criminal justice programs as one of the most unusual and disturbing infanticide cases in American history. If you know a new mother who is struggling, reach out. Offer help. Provide resources. Sometimes the smallest intervention can prevent the worst outcomes. Don't be afraid to ask difficult questions if something seems wrong. A child's life may depend on your courage to act. Case number 3, Tien Hawkins, April 2019, Hamilton County Court. Cincinnati police received a disturbing call on April 9, 2019. A 2-year-old child had been brought to Cincinnati Children's Hospital with injuries so severe that medical staff immediately suspected intentional harm. The toddler, identified as Miana Hawkins, had multiple broken bones, severe bruising, and signs of blunt force trauma. Despite the medical team's best efforts, the little girl passed away from her injuries. The person who brought Miana to the hospital was her mother, 23-year-old Tien Hawkins. Her explanation for the injuries changed multiple times, raising immediate red flags for investigators. Initially, Hawkins claimed the child had fallen downstairs, but medical examiners quickly determined the injuries were inconsistent with a simple fall. Miana had fractures in various stages of healing, indicating prolonged harm. She had internal bleeding, severe head trauma, and injuries consistent with being struck repeatedly with tremendous force. As detectives interviewed Hawkins, her story continued to evolve. She then claimed Miana had fallen off a bed. Then she suggested the child had injured herself playing. Each version contradicted the medical evidence and the previous statements. Hospital staff reported that Hawkins showed little emotion when informed of her daughter's critical condition. She appeared more concerned with her own situation than with her critically injured child. Nurses noted she spent more time on her phone than at her daughter's bedside. The investigation revealed a pattern of concerning behavior. Neighbors reported frequently hearing a child crying for extended periods. One witness stated they had seen Hawkins yelling at and roughly handling Miana in the weeks before her passing. School officials from programs the family had been involved with noted concerning behaviors, though none had risen to the level of formal reports. Child Protective Services had been called to the home twice in the previous year for welfare checks, but both times found insufficient evidence to remove the child. This fact would later fuel debates about intervention thresholds in child welfare systems. Autopsy results painted a devastating picture. Miana had sustained repeated harm over an extended period. She had old fractures that had healed improperly, new fractures, extensive bruising covering much of her small body, and fatal head trauma from blunt force impact. The medical examiner concluded the injuries could only have resulted from sustained physical harm. Tien Hawkins was arrested and charged with murder and child endangerment resulting in death. Prosecutors argued she had systematically harmed her daughter over months, culminating in the fatal incident on April 8 or 9, 2019. During court proceedings, disturbing details emerged about Hawkins' life and mindset. She had a history of substance-related issues and unstable relationships. Text messages showed she viewed Miana as a burden and frequently complained about the challenges of motherhood. In one concerning exchange, she wrote to a friend, "I can't deal with her anymore." The defense attempted to argue that Hawkins suffered from mental health issues and substance dependency that impaired her judgment. While these factors may have contributed to her state of mind, prosecutors successfully demonstrated that her actions were deliberate and sustained, showing consciousness of guilt through her attempts to create false narratives about the injuries. Witnesses testified to seeing Hawkins show affection to Miana in public, maintaining a facade of normal motherhood. But behind closed doors, evidence suggested that same child was being harmed, neglected, and ultimately fatally injured. The trial was emotionally devastating for everyone involved. Evidence of Miana's injuries was presented to the jury, causing several members to visibly cry. The little girl's father, who had limited custody, testified about his attempts to protect his daughter and his regrets about not pushing harder for full custody. In November 2019, Tien Hawkins was convicted of murder and child endangerment. The judge sentenced her to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 20 years, citing the particularly serious nature of the offense and the vulnerability of the victim. At sentencing, Hawkins made a brief statement claiming she loved her daughter and never meant to hurt her. But the evidence told a different story, a story of months of harm culminating in a 2-year-old child who suffered fatal injuries at the hands of the person who should have protected her above all else. Miana Hawkins was laid to rest in a small ceremony attended by family members and community advocates. Her grave marker bears the inscription, "Gone too soon. Forever in our hearts." She was 2 years, 3 months old. This case highlighted systemic issues in child protection. The fact that CPS had been called twice without finding sufficient cause for removal raised questions about training, resources, and protocols. Hamilton County subsequently implemented new procedures for follow-up investigations in cases involving young children. But no procedural change can bring back Miana. No policy revision can undo what she endured in her short life. She deserved love, safety, and a chance to grow up. Instead, she experienced pain, fear, and a tragic end at the hands of her own mother. If you work with children and something seems wrong, document it and report it. Err on the side of caution. Multiple reports, even if individually inconclusive, can establish patterns that save lives. Be persistent. Be thorough. Be the voice for children who cannot advocate for themselves. Case 4, Ruth Miller, March 2018, Stark County Court. On March 14, 2018, first responders were called to a residence in Canton, Ohio, for a report of a child drowning. What they found would become one of the most complex and tragic cases in Stark County's history. A case where mental illness, religion, and maternal responsibility collided with devastating consequences. 4-year-old Jeremiah Miller was found deceased in a bathtub, submerged in water. His mother, 32-year-old Ruth Miller, was present at the scene but appeared to be in a dissociative state, repeating religious phrases and showing little awareness of her surroundings. Paramedics attempted resuscitation, but Jeremiah had been underwater too long. He was pronounced dead at the scene. The initial assumption was a tragic accident, a child left unsupervised in a bathtub. But as investigators interviewed Ruth Miller, a far more disturbing picture emerged. Miller told police that God had commanded her to baptize her son. She described hearing voices instructing her to fully immerse Jeremiah in water to cleanse him of evil spirits. According to her statement, she held him underwater despite his struggles because the voices told her it was necessary for his salvation. This wasn't baptism. This was drowning. And Ruth Miller had deliberately held her son's head beneath the water until he stopped breathing. The investigation revealed that Miller had been exhibiting signs of serious mental illness for months prior to Jeremiah's death. Family members reported she had become increasingly religious to the point of obsession. She spoke frequently about demons, divine messages, and the need to protect her children from evil forces. Her husband, who worked long hours, said he had noticed changes in Ruth's behavior but didn't realize the severity of her condition. She had stopped taking medication prescribed for anxiety and depression several months earlier, claiming that prayer was the only medicine she needed. Friends from her church stated that Ruth had been attending services multiple times per week and had begun interpreting ordinary events as divine signs. She talked about receiving direct communications from God and expressed beliefs that her children were in spiritual danger. In the weeks before Jeremiah's death, Ruth had pulled him out of preschool, saying the teachers were trying to corrupt him with secular teachings. She kept him home, spending hours in prayer and attempting to perform what she called spiritual cleansing rituals. On the day of his death, Ruth apparently believed that fully submerging Jeremiah in water would drive out demons she thought had possessed him. Neighbors later reported hearing a child crying and screaming that morning, followed by eerie silence. The legal question became whether Ruth Miller understood right from wrong at the time of the killing. Ohio law requires that defendants be able to distinguish between right and wrong to be held criminally responsible for their actions. If mental illness prevented this understanding, she could be found not guilty by reason of insanity. Mental health experts examined Miller extensively. Psychiatrists diagnosed her with severe depression with psychotic features, a condition that can cause delusions and hallucinations. In her delusional state, she genuinely believed she was saving her son's soul, even as she was drowning him. However, prosecutors argued that even if Miller was experiencing delusions, she understood on some level that holding a child underwater causes death. They pointed to the fact that she did not call for help during the drowning and that she had searched online for information about baptism rituals in the days before the killing. The case divided the community. Some viewed Ruth Miller as a monster who used religion as an excuse for murder. Others saw her as a severely ill woman who needed treatment, not punishment, a victim of her own mind who never intended harm to her beloved son. Court-appointed psychologists presented testimony about the nature of psychotic delusions, and how they can completely override rational thought. They explained that Ruth Miller's brain, in its diseased state, had produced false realities that she believed as absolutely as any sane person believes in gravity. The trial was heart-wrenching. Photos of Jeremiah showed a bright-eyed, smiling little boy. Home videos played in court revealed him playing with toys, laughing with his father, and calling out "Mommy" to Ruth, who appeared loving and attentive in the footage. Family members testified that Ruth had been a devoted mother before her mental health deteriorated. She had attended every doctor's appointment, enrolled Jeremiah in educational programs, and spent hours playing with him. The transformation from loving mother to killer had occurred gradually as untreated mental illness consumed her mind. In September 2018, Ruth Miller was convicted of aggravated murder. Despite evidence of mental illness, the jury determined she had sufficient understanding of her actions to be held criminally responsible. The judge sentenced her to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. Miller was also ordered to undergo psychiatric treatment while incarcerated. She currently resides in a facility that houses mentally ill inmates, where she receives medication and therapy. According to reports from the Department of Corrections, Miller's mental health has improved significantly with proper treatment. She has expressed profound remorse for her son's death and reportedly spends hours each day in prayer, now understanding the delusion that drove her to kill the child she loved. This case sparked important conversations about maternal mental health, particularly postpartum and peripartum psychiatric disorders. Advocacy groups used Jeremiah's death to push for better screening, earlier intervention, and reduced stigma around mental health treatment for mothers. Jeremiah Miller's short life ended in terror and confusion as the person he trusted most held him underwater until his small body ceased its struggle. He didn't understand why his mother, who had kissed him goodnight every evening, was suddenly hurting him. His last moments were filled with fear, pain, and the ultimate betrayal. The tragedy of this case lies in its preventability. If Ruth Miller had received proper mental health treatment, if family members had understood the warning signs, if the healthcare system had better supports for struggling mothers, Jeremiah might still be alive. Mental illness is not an excuse, but it is an explanation. And understanding that explanation can help prevent future tragedies. If someone you know is experiencing dramatic personality changes, religious obsessions, or talk of hearing voices, please help them access mental health services immediately. Early intervention saves lives, both the lives of those suffering from mental illness and the lives of those around them. Case 5, Daisha Summers, September 2021, Cuyahoga County Court. Cleveland police responded to a 911 call on September 12, 2021. The caller, 24-year-old Daisha Summers, reported that her 10-month-old daughter, Zariah, was unresponsive and not breathing. When paramedics arrived at the East Side Cleveland department, they found the infant in cardiac arrest with visible injuries that immediately raised suspicion. Zariah Summers was rushed to Rainbow Babies and Children's Hospital, where medical staff fought desperately to save her life. But the injuries were too severe, too extensive. The baby girl died within hours of arrival. And when doctors examined her tiny body, they discovered evidence of abuse so brutal that even experienced pediatric trauma specialists were shaken. The autopsy revealed that Zariah had suffered catastrophic blunt force trauma to her head and torso. She had multiple skull fractures, brain bleeding, broken ribs, liver lacerations, and extensive bruising covering her small body. The medical examiner determined these injuries could not have occurred from a fall or accident. They required tremendous force applied repeatedly over time. Most disturbing was the pattern of injuries in various stages of healing. Zariah had old fractures alongside new ones, fading bruises next to fresh ones. This child had been systematically abused for weeks or possibly months before the fatal attack. Detectives interviewed Daisha Summers at the hospital. Her account of what happened was vague and constantly shifting. First, she claimed Zariah had fallen off the couch. Then she said the baby had been dropped. Later, she suggested Zariah had been injured while playing with other children. None of these explanations matched the medical evidence. Forensic pediatricians explained that the force required to cause Zariah's injuries would be equivalent to a high-speed car crash or a fall from a multi-story building. A simple tumble-off furniture couldn't possibly account for the severity and multiplicity of the trauma. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered troubling information about Daisha Summers' life and behavior. Neighbors reported frequently hearing a baby crying for hours at a time, sometimes late into the night. One resident stated they had considered calling authorities multiple times but didn't want to get involved in other people's business, a decision they would deeply regret. Social media posts told a disturbing dual story. Publicly, Summers posted photos of Zariah with captions about being a devoted mother. But private messages revealed a different reality. She complained constantly about the stress of motherhood, expressed resentment towards Zariah for interfering with her social life, and made statements suggesting she viewed the baby as a burden. In one chilling text exchange just days before Zariah's death, Summers wrote to a friend, "I don't know how much more of this crying I can take. I just want her to shut up." The friend responded with concern, asking if Summers needed help or a break. Summers never responded to that offer. Investigators also discovered that Child Protective Services had received an anonymous tip about potential neglect at Summers' residence 2 months before Zariah's death. A caseworker had conducted a home visit, noted the apartment was messy but found no immediate evidence of abuse, and closed the case. Zariah appeared healthy at that visit, though medical records later showed she already had healing fractures from previous abuse. The investigation revealed that Summers often left Zariah with various babysitters and friends, sometimes for days at a time. Multiple caregivers reported that the baby always seemed hungry and would eat ravenously when fed. Some noticed bruises but accepted Summers' explanations that the baby was clumsy or had fallen. On the day of Zariah's fatal injuries, Summers had been alone with her daughter all day. Security footage from the apartment building showed no visitors. Whatever happened to Zariah occurred at the hands of her mother, behind closed doors, with no witnesses. Based on the severity of the injuries and expert testimony about the force required to inflict them, prosecutors theorized that Summers had violently shaken and struck Zariah, possibly multiple times over several hours. The baby's suffering must have been immense and prolonged. Daisha Summers was arrested and charged with murder and child endangerment. The evidence against her was overwhelming. Medical reports, expert testimony, inconsistent statements, and the undeniable fact that she was the only person with access to Zariah during the time period when the fatal injuries occurred. During pretrial proceedings, the defense attempted to suggest that previous caregivers might have injured the child. But medical examiners testified that the fatal injuries were fresh and could be precisely timed to the day Zariah was exclusively in her mother's care. The trial began in May 2022. Prosecutors presented a methodical case built on forensic evidence, medical expertise, and timeline analysis. Jurors saw photographs of Zariah's injuries, images so disturbing that several jurors requested breaks to compose themselves. Pediatric specialists testified about each injury, explaining the force required and the pain the infant would have experienced. They described how Zariah's small body had been repeatedly traumatized, how she had suffered, how she had endured pain that would incapacitate an adult. The defense argued that Summers was a young, overwhelmed mother who may have accidentally harmed her daughter in a moment of frustration, not intending to cause serious injury. They presented witnesses who described Summers as loving and attentive in public settings. But prosecutors countered with the evidence of sustained, repeated abuse. The pattern of injuries over time demonstrated this was not a single tragic moment, but an ongoing pattern of violence. The severity of the final attack showed deliberate brutality, not an accident. In June 2022, the jury convicted Daisha Summers of murder and child endangerment. The verdict came after only a few hours of deliberation. The evidence had been clear, the conclusion inevitable. At sentencing in August 2022, the judge delivered harsh words. "You were trusted with the most precious responsibility, caring for an innocent, helpless child. You violated that trust in the most egregious way. You tortured and murdered your own daughter." Daisha Summers was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 28 years. She showed no visible emotion as the sentence was read. Family members of Zariah, including the baby's father, wept openly in the courtroom. Zariah Summers lived only 10 months. She never learned to walk or say her first words. She never celebrated a first birthday. Her brief life was filled with pain, fear, and suffering inflicted by the person who should have protected her above all else. This case underscores the critical importance of community vigilance. Multiple neighbors heard signs of distress, but didn't act. An earlier CPS intervention found nothing wrong when, in fact, the child was already being abused. These failures allowed the abuse to continue until it became fatal. We must do better. When we hear a child crying excessively, when we notice unexplained injuries, when our instincts tell us something is wrong, we must act. It's better to make a report that turns out to be unfounded than to stay silent while a child suffers and dies. Case 6. Anjelica Stewart, July 2017, Franklin County Court. The Columbus Fire Department received a frantic call on the evening of July 23, 2017. A woman reported that her 3 children were drowning in a bathtub. Firefighters and paramedics rushed to the North Side Columbus home, unsure what they would find but preparing for the worst. What they discovered was a scene of chaos and horror. 3 young children, ages 5, 3, and 18 months, were pulled from a bathtub filled with water. All 3 were unconscious. All 3 showed signs of near drowning and physical trauma. And their mother, 30-year-old Anjelica Stewart, was standing nearby, soaking wet, claiming the children had somehow all fallen into the bathtub at once. The children were immediately transported to Nationwide Children's Hospital in critical condition. Thanks to the rapid response of emergency services and the skill of the medical team, all 3 children survived. But what investigators uncovered about the events of that evening would reveal this was no accident. It was an attempted triple murder. As doctors treated the children, they discovered injuries far beyond what would be expected from a simple drowning incident. The oldest child had extensive bruising and marks consistent with being forcefully held underwater. The middle child had defensive wounds on his arms and hands, suggesting he had fought against someone. The youngest had injuries indicating rough handling. When the children were stable enough to be interviewed, the 2 older kids told a horrifying story. They said their mother had filled the bathtub and then forcibly held them underwater, one by one. The 5-year-old described fighting to breathe, seeing her siblings struggling, and believing they were all going to die. Anjelica Stewart was arrested at the hospital and charged with 3 counts of attempted murder. Her initial story, that the children had all accidentally fallen into the tub, was obviously false. The evidence and testimony made clear this was a deliberate attempt to drown all 3 of her children. The investigation revealed a complex picture of a mother in crisis. Stewart had a history of mental health issues, including depression and anxiety. She had recently gone through a difficult breakup with the children's father and was facing financial hardship. Friends reported she had seemed increasingly stressed and overwhelmed in the weeks before the incident. However, there were also troubling indicators that suggested planning rather than a spontaneous mental health crisis. Stewart had searched online for information about drowning, how long it takes to drown, and whether children could be revived after submersion. These searches occurred in the days before the attempted drowning, suggesting premeditation. Text messages revealed that Stewart had written to a friend earlier that day, "I can't do this anymore. I can't keep going. It would be better for everyone if we were all gone." The friend, not fully understanding the gravity of the statement, responded with general encouragement but didn't realize Stewart was contemplating murder-suicide. On the evening of July 23rd, Stewart fed her children dinner, gave them baths as usual, and then, according to the children's testimony and forensic evidence, attempted to drown them one at a time. She started with the youngest, holding the 18-month-old underwater until the baby went limp. Then she moved to the 3-year-old, and finally the 5-year-old. The oldest child's resistance and screaming apparently caused Stewart to hesitate. Neighbors heard the commotion and called building security. This intervention, combined with Stewart's own ambivalence about completing the act, led her to call 911 before all 3 children had died. Mental health experts evaluated Stewart extensively. She was diagnosed with major depressive disorder and was experiencing a severe depressive episode at the time of the incident. However, she understood that drowning her children was wrong and would result in their deaths. She had the cognitive capacity to know her actions were unlawful and harmful. The defense argued that Stewart's mental illness impaired her judgment to the point where she believed killing her children was an act of mercy, that she was saving them from a life of poverty and struggle. This type of thinking, while clearly delusional, indicated she understood her actions would end their lives. Prosecutors presented a forceful case that regardless of Stewart's mental state, she had attempted to murder 3 helpless children and came horrifyingly close to succeeding. Only luck and quick intervention saved those children's lives. The trial was emotionally charged. The children, who had been placed in foster care and were making slow recoveries from both physical and psychological trauma, did not testify in person. Instead, their initial interviews were shown to the jury. Watching 5- and 3-year-old children describe their mother trying to drown them left hardly a dry eye in the courtroom. Medical experts testified about the children's injuries and the terror they experienced. Psychologists explained the long-term trauma that would likely affect these children for the rest of their lives. The betrayal of trust, the fear, the psychological damage. These wounds would persist long after the physical injuries healed. In November 2017, Anjelica Stewart was convicted on all 3 counts of attempted murder. The jury deliberated for less than a full day before returning the guilty verdicts. At sentencing in January 2018, the judge acknowledged Stewart's mental health issues but emphasized the severity of her crimes. Mental illness may explain your actions, but it does not excuse them, the judge stated. You tried to kill your own children. You held them underwater while they fought for their lives. That is not mercy. That is murder, and only circumstance prevented it from being successful. Stewart was sentenced to 45 years in prison, 15 years for each attempted murder, to be served consecutively. She will be eligible for parole when she is 75 years old. The 3 children were adopted by a loving family who understood their trauma and committed to providing them with therapy, stability, and support. According to reports from their caseworkers, the children are slowly healing, though they still have nightmares and struggle with trust and attachment issues. The oldest child, now a teenager, has reportedly expressed conflicting feelings about her mother, love mixed with fear, longing mixed with anger. This complex emotional landscape is common among children who survive parental violence, and it will take years of therapy to fully process. This case highlights the desperate need for better mental health resources, particularly for struggling single mothers. Anjelica Stewart had sought help at various points, but never received comprehensive, sustained treatment. The system failed her, and ultimately, she failed her children in the most catastrophic way. But we cannot simply blame the system. Stewart made choices. She chose to search for information about drowning. She chose to fill that bathtub. She chose to hold her babies underwater while they fought for their lives. Mental illness may have clouded her judgment, but it did not remove her agency entirely. The lesson from this case is twofold. We need better mental health support systems, and we need individuals to take responsibility for seeking help before crisis points are reached. Case 7. Amanda Jo Bunner, December 2016, Geauga County Court. On December 15, 2016, emergency responders were called to a home in Chardon, Ohio, for reports of a child not breathing. When they arrived, they found 2-year-old Zachary Bunner lying on a couch, unconscious and unresponsive, with severe head injuries. His mother, 28-year-old Amanda Jo Bunner, claimed the boy had fallen and hit his head. But the injuries told a very different story. A story of brutal violence inflicted on a defenseless toddler by the person he called Mama. Zachary was rushed to University Hospital's Rainbow Babies and Children's Hospital in Cleveland, where the pediatric trauma team worked frantically to save his life. The CT scans revealed catastrophic brain injuries. The little boy had severe bleeding in his brain, skull fractures, and swelling that was causing irreparable damage. Despite aggressive medical intervention, Zachary died 2 days later, on December 17. The autopsy painted a horrific picture. Zachary had both old and new injuries. He had healing fractures that were weeks old, extensive bruising in various stages of healing, and signs of chronic abuse. The fatal injury was blunt force trauma to the head with such violence that it caused his brain to hemorrhage massively. Medical examiners were clear. These injuries could not have resulted from a simple fall. The force required to cause Zachary's skull fractures and brain damage was equivalent to being struck with a heavy object or slammed against a hard surface with tremendous force. This was not an accident. This was murder. Detectives began a thorough investigation into Amanda Bunner and her household. What they discovered was a pattern of abuse, neglect, and a mother who viewed her son as an inconvenience rather than a blessing. Neighbors reported hearing a child crying frequently at the Bunner residence. Some stated they had seen Amanda yelling at Zachary in the yard, using language and a tone that seemed excessive for a 2-year-old child. One neighbor recalled seeing Zachary with a black eye several months earlier. When asked about it, Amanda claimed he had run into a doorframe. Text messages on Amanda's phone revealed disturbing attitudes toward motherhood. She frequently complained about Zachary's behavior, called him names, and expressed resentment about the limitations motherhood placed on her social life. In one message sent just a week before Zachary's death, she wrote, "I can't stand him sometimes. He never shuts up, and he's always getting into everything." Child Protective Services had been called to the home once, approximately 4 months before Zachary's death, following a report from a concerned daycare provider who noticed bruises on the boy. A caseworker visited, interviewed Amanda, and observed Zachary. The bruises were noted but explained away as typical toddler bumps and falls. The case was closed after one visit. This failure to adequately investigate or follow up would later become a major point of criticism. The daycare provider who made the initial report stated she had serious concerns, but was told by CPS that the evidence wasn't sufficient to warrant further action. 4 months later, Zachary was dead. On the day of the fatal injury, Amanda had been alone with Zachary. Her boyfriend, who also lived in the home, was at work. Security footage from a nearby business showed Amanda's car had not left the driveway all day. Whatever happened to Zachary occurred inside that home, with only his mother present. Based on the timeline established by medical experts, Zachary sustained his fatal head injury sometime in the early afternoon of December 15th. However, Amanda didn't call 911 until nearly 4 hours later, around 5 o'clock in the evening. During those 4 hours, Zachary was likely unconscious and experiencing catastrophic brain bleeding that might have been survivable if he had received immediate medical attention. Prosecutors theorized that Amanda struck or slammed Zachary in a fit of rage, possibly because the toddler was being loud or misbehaving. When she realized the severity of his injury, she panicked and delayed calling for help, perhaps hoping he would recover on his own, perhaps trying to fabricate a believable story. The delay in seeking medical care became a crucial element of the prosecution's case. Even after inflicting the injury, Amanda could have called for help immediately and potentially saved her son's life. Instead, she allowed him to lay dying while she figured out how to explain his injuries. Amanda Jo Bunner was arrested and charged with murder. The evidence against her was substantial. Medical expert testimony, forensic analysis, documented history of abuse, and her own inconsistent statements about what happened. The trial began in September 2017. Prosecutors methodically built their case, presenting the medical evidence, the pattern of prior injuries, the damning text messages, and the inexplicable delay in seeking treatment. Defense attorneys argued that Amanda was a young, stressed mother who may have accidentally caused Zachary's injury and then panicked. They attempted to suggest that the boyfriend might have been responsible, though he had a solid alibi and no evidence connected him to the abuse. Witnesses testified about Amanda's behavior. Some described her as short-tempered and easily frustrated. Others noted that she seemed to lack the patience necessary for toddlerhood, becoming angry when Zachary exhibited normal 2-year-old behaviors like crying, making messes, or demanding attention. The jury heard testimony from the emergency responders who first arrived at the scene. They described finding Zachary barely clinging to life, and Amanda seeming more concerned with her own story than with her dying son's condition. One paramedic testified that when asked what happened, Amanda's immediate response was, "It was an accident," before anyone had even suggested otherwise, a response that seemed rehearsed and defensive rather than organically concerned. Medical experts explained to the jury exactly how much force would be required to cause Zachary's injuries. They demonstrated that a simple fall, even from a height, wouldn't create the pattern of trauma observed. This required direct application of violent force, either through striking with an object or slamming the child against a hard surface. Perhaps most heartbreaking was testimony from Zachary's daycare providers, who described him as a sweet, affectionate child who loved to play and learn. He was starting to speak in short sentences, loved trucks and dinosaurs, and always greeted his teachers with a big smile. They noticed the bruises, noticed he sometimes flinched when touched, noticed he ate ravenously as if he weren't being fed enough at home. They reported their concerns, but it wasn't enough to save him. In October 2017, after several days of deliberation, the jury convicted Amanda Jo Bunner of murder. The verdict brought tears of relief from Zachary's extended family members who had attended every day of the trial, seeking justice for a little boy who had no voice of his own. At sentencing in December 2017, the judge addressed Amanda directly. "You were given the most precious gift, a child to love and nurture. Instead, you abused him, tortured him, and ultimately murdered him." Zachary Bunner deserved a mother who would protect him. He deserved to grow up, to learn, to play, to experience life. You took all of that away from him. Amanda Jo Bunner was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. She will be in her 50s before she is eligible for release. In victim impact statements, Zachary's paternal grandmother spoke through tears. He was just a baby. He needed love and safety, and his mother gave him pain and death. We will never see him grow up. We will never hear him laugh again. Amanda took everything from him, and from us. Zachary Bunner was buried in a small cemetery in Geauga County. His grave is frequently visited by family members who leave toys, flowers, and notes expressing love for a little boy taken too soon. His headstone reads, "Our little angel, forever too." This case, like so many others, revealed failures in the child protection system. Warning signs were present, bruises, concerned reports from caregivers, neighbors' observations, but they were not acted upon with sufficient urgency or thoroughness. Zachary fell through the cracks, and it cost him his life. Child protective services are often underfunded, understaffed, and overwhelmed with cases. Caseworkers carry impossible caseloads and must make difficult decisions with limited information and resources. These systemic problems contributed to Zachary's death, but they don't excuse it. We must demand better funding for child welfare agencies, better training for caseworkers, and better protocols for following up on concerning reports. We must also empower ordinary citizens, neighbors, teachers, daycare providers, doctors, to make reports and to persist if their concerns aren't adequately addressed. Zachary Bunner's life mattered. His death should not be in vain. If even one child is saved because someone remembered Zachary's story and decided to speak up about concerning signs of abuse, then perhaps some meaning can be found in this tragedy. If you see something, say something. If you say something and feel it's not being taken seriously, say it again. Louder. To more people. Keep advocating until that child is safe. Be persistent. Be demanding. Be the person who refuses to let another child fall through the cracks. Zachary needed someone to do that for him. Make sure you're that someone for the next child at risk. Case 8, Lashanda Wilder, January 2018, Franklin County Court. For months, neighbors wondered about the little boy who used to play in the yard. 8-year-old Jonathan Wilder had been a familiar sight in the North Columbus neighborhood, riding his bike, playing with other kids, always with a bright smile. But one day, he simply disappeared. When neighbors asked his mother, 34-year-old Lashanda Wilder, about Jonathan's whereabouts, she offered vague explanations. He was staying with relatives. He was at a special school. He was visiting his father. The truth was far more horrific. Jonathan wasn't with relatives or at school. He was dead, hidden in the attic of the very home where neighbors would occasionally chat with his mother. His small body lay wrapped in plastic and blankets, slowly decomposing just feet above where Lashanda Wilder lived her daily life. The horrifying truth came to light on January 12, 2018, when police executed a search warrant at Wilder's residence following tips from concerned individuals who had not seen Jonathan in over 6 months. Columbus Police Detective Ryan Hurd led the search team into the 2-story home, unsure what they would find but preparing for the worst based on the information they had received. The search of the main floor and basement revealed nothing unusual. But when investigators climbed into the attic, they discovered a scene that would haunt them for the rest of their careers. There, concealed beneath layers of plastic sheeting, blankets, and boxes, was the severely decomposed body of a young child. Dental records confirmed what investigators already suspected. This was Jonathan Wilder, the missing 8-year-old boy. He had been dead for months, hidden in that sweltering attic while his mother continued to live in the home below, going about her daily routine as if nothing was wrong. The autopsy faced challenges due to the state of decomposition, but medical examiners were able to determine several crucial facts. Jonathan had suffered blunt force trauma prior to death. He showed signs of chronic malnutrition and neglect. While the exact cause of death was difficult to pinpoint due to decomposition, the injuries and circumstances pointed clearly to homicide. Lashanda Wilder was arrested immediately. During initial interviews, she offered conflicting stories. First, she claimed Jonathan had run away and she didn't know where he was. When confronted with the discovery of his body in her own attic, she changed her story, saying he had died accidentally and she had panicked, not knowing what to do with the body. But investigators weren't buying it. The evidence suggested a pattern of abuse leading to Jonathan's death, followed by a calculated cover-up. Wilder had hidden her son's body and maintained an elaborate deception for months, convincing neighbors and even some family members that Jonathan was alive and well elsewhere. The investigation revealed deeply troubling information about Jonathan's life before his death. School records showed he had been withdrawn from school in August 2017, with Wilder claiming she was homeschooling him. This removed the one consistent outside oversight of the child's welfare. Former teachers described Jonathan as a sweet, quiet child who sometimes came to school hungry and wearing dirty clothes. One teacher had filed a report with Child Protective Services the previous school year after noticing bruises on Jonathan's arms, but the investigation concluded without finding sufficient evidence for removal. Neighbors who had known Jonathan said he had seemed increasingly thin and withdrawn in the months before he disappeared. One neighbor recalled asking Jonathan if he was okay and the boy responding, "I'm not allowed to talk about it," a chilling statement that the neighbor deeply regretted not pursuing further. Text messages recovered from Wilder's phone showed she had been struggling financially and emotionally. She complained frequently about the stress of single motherhood. More disturbingly, in messages to friends, she sometimes referred to Jonathan in harsh, resentful terms, calling him the problem and saying she wished she had never had him. Prosecutors pieced together a likely timeline of events. Sometime in late summer or early fall of 2017, Wilder apparently attacked Jonathan in a fit of rage, striking him with enough force to cause fatal injuries. Whether she intended to kill him or just hurt him remained unclear, but the result was the same. An 8-year-old boy died at his mother's hands. Rather than call for help or report the death, Wilder concealed the body in the attic. She then spent the following months maintaining the fiction that Jonathan was alive, telling different stories to different people about his whereabouts. She continued to receive benefits related to Jonathan's care, essentially defrauding the system while her son's body decomposed above her. The case against Lashanda Wilder was strong but faced some challenges due to the decomposition of Jonathan's body, which made determining exact cause and time of death difficult. However, the circumstantial evidence was overwhelming. Her changing stories, the concealment of the body, the documented history of abuse, and the complete lack of any innocent explanation for a dead child hidden in an attic. Faced with this mountain of evidence and potentially life without parole if convicted at trial, Wilder eventually agreed to a plea deal. In June 2018, she pleaded guilty to murder in exchange for a sentence of life in prison with the possibility of parole after 15 years. The plea agreement sparked controversy. Jonathan's extended family members felt the sentence was too lenient for a mother who had killed her child and then hidden his body for months. Advocacy groups questioned whether justice had truly been served. But prosecutors explained that given the evidentiary challenges and the certainty that Wilder would serve substantial time, the plea was the most reliable path to guaranteed conviction and imprisonment. At the plea hearing, Lashanda Wilder offered a brief apology, stating she never meant to hurt Jonathan and wished she could take it back. Her words rang hollow to those who knew that she had hidden her son's body and lied about it for months. If she truly felt remorse, she had had numerous opportunities over those months to come forward and face the consequences of her actions. She chose concealment instead. Jonathan Wilder was finally laid to rest in a proper burial in July 2018, nearly a year after his death. His grave is maintained by extended family members who continue to mourn the loss of a bright, kind child who deserved so much better than what life gave him. This case highlights a particularly insidious aspect of child abuse: isolation. By withdrawing Jonathan from school, and limiting his contact with others, Wilder removed the safety nets that might have saved his life. Teachers, counselors, coaches, and other adults who interact with children regularly can spot warning signs of abuse, but only if they have access to the children. When a child is suddenly pulled from school, especially under vague circumstances, it should raise red flags. While homeschooling is a legitimate educational choice for many families, it can also be used to hide abuse. Welfare checks and monitoring systems for homeschooled children vary widely by state and locality, and Jonathan's death demonstrates the deadly consequences when isolated children fall through the cracks. Jonathan Wilder loved superheroes, especially Spider-Man. He enjoyed drawing, playing video games with friends, and riding his bike around the neighborhood. He dreamed of becoming a police officer when he grew up. He wanted to help people, to protect people, to make a difference. Instead, at age 8, he became a victim. He suffered abuse, died violently, and spent months hidden away like garbage in an attic. His mother, the person who should have loved and protected him above all else, was his killer. Lashanda Wilder remains imprisoned, serving her sentence at the Ohio Reformatory for Women. She will be eligible for parole in 2033, when she will be 49 years old. Whether she will actually be released remains to be seen, but even if she is granted parole, she will have served 15 years, far less than the lifetime Jonathan lost. If you are a parent struggling with anger or violent urges toward your child, please seek help immediately. Call a domestic violence hotline, speak to a therapist, reach out to family or friends, contact social services. There are resources available. There are people who want to help. Your temporary moment of anger is not worth your child's life or your own freedom. And if you notice a child in your community has suddenly disappeared from sight, ask questions. If the answers don't make sense, report it. Trust your instincts. Persistence in the face of vague explanations could save a life. Case 9. Timmeka Eggleton, November 2019, Cuyahoga County Court. On November 7, 2019, Cleveland police responded to a call about an unresponsive child at a home on the city's east side. When they arrived, they found 3-year-old Ania Day Garrett lying lifeless on a bed, her small body bearing injuries that immediately suggested severe abuse. Paramedics attempted resuscitation, but Ania was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner who conducted the autopsy would later testify that in 20 years of examining child abuse cases, Ania's injuries were among the worst he had ever seen. The little girl had suffered catastrophic blunt force trauma to her head and body. She had skull fractures, brain bleeding, broken ribs, liver lacerations, extensive bruising covering nearly every visible part of her body, and injuries to her internal organs. Some injuries were fresh. Others had been healing for days or weeks, indicating prolonged abuse. Most heartbreakingly, Ania had injuries consistent with being struck, kicked, punched, and possibly thrown against hard surfaces. The medical examiner determined that the force and number of blows she endured would have caused excruciating pain and suffering. This child had been tortured. The person responsible for Ania's care at the time of her death was her mother's girlfriend, Sierra Day, who was later convicted of murder. But the prosecution of Sierra Day revealed a shocking truth. Ania's biological mother, 28-year-old Timmeka Eggleton, had witnessed and participated in the abuse of her own daughter. Eggleton had custody of Ania and another older child. According to court documents and testimony, Eggleton was aware of the ongoing abuse Day inflicted on Ania, but did nothing to stop it. More than that, evidence suggested Eggleton herself had struck and abused the child on multiple occasions. In the days before Ania's death, neighbors reported hearing a child screaming and crying for extended periods. One neighbor called police to request a welfare check, but when officers arrived, no one answered the door, and without evidence of immediate danger, they could not force entry. Ania was left in the home with the people who were killing her. The investigation uncovered horrifying details about the last weeks of Ania's life. She had been kept isolated in the home, not allowed to play outside with other children. When she cried or misbehaved, she was beaten. When she was hungry, she was sometimes denied food as punishment. She lived in constant fear, constant pain, knowing that the people who were supposed to love her were the source of her suffering. Text messages between Eggleton and Day showed both women discussing discipline that crossed far into abuse. They joked about Ania crying and complained about her neediness. In one exchange, Day wrote about striking Ania, and Eggleton responded with a laughing emoji. They treated the torture of a 3-year-old child as if it were amusing. Child Protective Services had been involved with the family previously, following reports of concerning behavior and possible neglect. However, caseworkers had assessed the situation and determined that removal was not necessary at that time. Ania remained in her mother's custody, where she would ultimately be murdered. On the day of Ania's death, both Eggleton and Day were present in the home. Medical evidence suggested Ania sustained her fatal injuries in the morning and lingered for hours before dying in the afternoon. During those hours, neither woman called for medical help. They let a 3-year-old child die slowly, knowing she needed emergency care. When they finally called 911, they claimed Ania had fallen. But the medical evidence made clear this was no fall. The injuries were numerous, severe, and could only have resulted from sustained, violent assault. Both women were arrested. Sierra Day was charged with and eventually convicted of murder, receiving a life sentence without parole. But Timmeka Eggleton, as Ania's mother, bore a special culpability in the eyes of prosecutors and the community. Eggleton was charged with murder and child endangerment. The prosecution argued that even if Day had struck the fatal blows, Eggleton was equally responsible. She had failed to protect her daughter. She had participated in abuse. She had allowed the situation to escalate to murder. She was Ania's mother, and she had catastrophically failed in that most fundamental duty. The trial revealed the depths of Eggleton's failure as a parent. Witnesses testified that Eggleton prioritized her relationship with Day over her children's welfare. When Ania showed signs of abuse, Eggleton made excuses. When opportunities arose to seek help or remove the children from danger, Eggleton chose inaction. Psychologists testified about the unique betrayal children experience when their primary caregiver participates in or allows abuse. For Ania, there was no safe person, no one to run to, no rescue coming. Her mother, the person who gave her life, allowed that life to be taken through torture and violence. Photos of Ania shown to the jury depicted a beautiful little girl with bright eyes and a shy smile. Videos from birthday parties and family gatherings showed her laughing and playing, giving no hint of the horror her life would become. The contrast between these happy images and the crime scene photos was unbearable for many observers. In March 2020, Timmeka Eggleton pleaded guilty to murder and child endangerment. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the possibility of life without parole if convicted at trial, she accepted a plea deal. At her sentencing hearing in May 2020, Eggleton offered an apology that the judge described as insufficient and self-serving. She claimed she had been under Day's influence and didn't know how to protect her daughter. But evidence showed she had numerous opportunities to seek help, to call authorities, to remove her children from danger. She chose not to take those opportunities. The judge sentenced Timmeka Eggleton to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 22 years. In delivering the sentence, the judge stated, "You brought Ania into this world, and you allowed her to be tortured out of it. You failed in every way a mother can fail. This sentence can never bring Ania back, but it ensures you will face consequences for your horrific choices." Family members of Ania, including her paternal grandmother who had sought custody before the murder, delivered victim impact statements. Through tears, they described a sweet, loving child who deserved a chance at life. They spoke of their guilt at not being able to save her, their rage at the women who killed her, and their commitment to ensuring Ania is never forgotten. Ania Day Garrett was buried in a pink casket decorated with butterflies. Hundreds of community members attended the funeral, many who had never met Ania but were moved by her story and determined to honor her memory. A scholarship fund was established in her name to support other children in crisis. This case sparked outrage and calls for reform in Ohio's child welfare system. How did a child with documented CPS involvement end up tortured to death? Why weren't earlier warning signs acted upon more aggressively? What systemic changes are needed to prevent future Anias? These are difficult questions without easy answers. Child welfare systems across the country struggle with impossible caseloads, insufficient funding, and the challenge of balancing family preservation with child safety. But Ania's death makes clear that current approaches are failing too many children. Timmeka Eggleton and Sierra Day both remain incarcerated. Eggleton's older child, who was removed from the home after Ania's death, is being raised by relatives and reportedly receiving therapy to process the trauma of losing a sibling and having both parental figures imprisoned for murder. Ania de Garrett lived only 3 years, 4 months, and 12 days. Her life was cut short by the 2 people entrusted with her care. She never went to preschool, never learned to ride a bike, never got to experience the countless joys and milestones of childhood. She knew fear, pain, and betrayal far beyond what any child should ever experience. We remember Ania not just as a victim, but as a person, a little girl who loved dolls and cartoons, who giggled when tickled, who said, "I love you" to family members, who deserved so much better than what she got. If you work in child welfare, education, healthcare, or any field that brings you in contact with children, please remain vigilant. Question concerning injuries. Document patterns. Advocate forcefully for at-risk children. Sometimes the system fails, but individual people within that system can still make a difference. And if you are a parent or know a parent who is struggling, overwhelmed, or showing warning signs of abusive behavior, intervene. Offer help. Insist on it if necessary. Temporary discomfort or conflict is worth it if it saves a child's life. Don't wait until it's too late. Ania deserved someone to intervene forcefully on her behalf. Make sure you're that person for the next child who needs help. Case 10. Nicole Diar, March 2015, Lorain County Court. In the early morning hours of March 17, 2015, firefighters responded to a house fire in Elyria, Ohio. The blaze was intense, consuming the small single-family home rapidly. Neighbors had called 911 reporting flames and smoke, and first responders rushed to the scene. As firefighters battled the flames, they discovered something horrifying inside: the body of a young child. The remains were found in an upstairs bedroom, burned beyond recognition. It would take dental records to confirm what investigators already suspected. This was 4-year-old Christian Diar, son of Nicole Diar. Initially, authorities treated this as a tragic accident, a house fire that claimed a child's life. But as arson investigators examined the scene and as medical examiners conducted the autopsy, a far more sinister picture emerged. The autopsy revealed that Christian had been dead before the fire started. He had suffered severe blunt force trauma to his head and body. His skull was fractured. He had internal bleeding. The medical examiner determined that Christian had been beaten to death, and then his body had been burned in an attempt to cover up the murder. Arson investigators confirmed that the fire had been deliberately set. Accelerants were used in multiple locations throughout the house, creating a burn pattern consistent with intentional arson rather than accidental fire. Someone had murdered a 4-year-old boy and then tried to destroy the evidence by burning down the house. All evidence pointed to one person: Christian's mother, 29-year-old Nicole Diar. The investigation revealed that Nicole had been the only adult present in the home when Christian died. She had called 911 to report the fire, but had not mentioned that her son was inside until firefighters were already on scene, a delay that struck investigators as suspicious. When questioned, Nicole's story was inconsistent and contradictory. She claimed she had been asleep when the fire started and didn't know Christian was still in the house. But evidence showed she had been awake and had actually left the residence before calling 911, suggesting she knew exactly what was happening. Neighbors reported a troubled household. They frequently heard yelling and sometimes the sound of a child crying. One neighbor recalled seeing Christian with bruises several weeks before his death and asking Nicole about them. Nicole had explained them away as typical childhood injuries from playing too rough. The investigation uncovered a history of instability in Nicole Diar's life. She had struggled with substance abuse issues and had unstable employment. She had been in multiple tumultuous relationships. Friends and family members reported that she often seemed overwhelmed by motherhood and complained about Christian's behavior and neediness. In the weeks before Christian's death, Nicole had searched online for information about accidental fires, house fires, and whether smoke inhalation or burns could conceal previous injuries. These searches established premeditation. She had been planning not just to kill her son, but to cover up the crime. Text messages revealed Nicole's mindset. She had written to a friend just days before the murder: "I can't take this anymore. He won't stop crying, and nothing I do works." The friend had suggested she seek help or let Christian stay with relatives for a while, But Nicole never followed through on these suggestions. On the night of March 16th into the early morning of March 17th, prosecutors believe the following occurred. Christian, who was 4 years old and likely exhibiting normal but challenging childhood behaviors, did something that triggered Nicole's rage. Perhaps he wouldn't go to bed, or he made a mess, or he cried too loudly. Whatever the trigger, Nicole snapped. She struck Christian repeatedly with enough force to fracture his skull and cause fatal internal injuries. Whether she intended to kill him or simply lost control, the result was the same. A 4-year-old boy beaten to death by his own mother. When Nicole realized Christian was dead, she panicked. Rather than call for help or turn herself in, she made a calculated decision to hide the crime. She placed Christian's body in his bedroom, poured accelerant throughout the house, set multiple fires, and fled the residence. She then called 911, planning to claim the fire was accidental and that Christian had tragically died in the blaze. But investigators saw through the deception. The medical evidence of pre-existing trauma, the arson evidence of intentional fire setting, the suspicious timeline, and Nicole's own incriminating online searches all pointed to the truth. This was murder disguised as accident. Nicole Diar was arrested and charged with aggravated murder, arson, and tampering with evidence. She pleaded not guilty, and the case went to trial in November 2015. The trial was extensive and emotionally exhausting. Prosecutors presented forensic evidence, medical testimony, arson expert analysis, and digital evidence from Nicole's computer and phone. They showed the jury photos of Christian alive and happy, contrasted with the horrific crime scene images. They painted a picture of a mother who killed her child in rage and then tried to burn the evidence. Defense attorneys argued that Nicole was a struggling single mother who had made terrible mistakes but did not intentionally kill her son. They suggested Christian's injuries could have been accidental and that the fire was a panicked attempt to hide what she feared would be seen as negligence. But the prosecution's case was too strong. The pattern of injuries, the timeline, the searches, the accelerant use, all of it pointed to deliberate murder and calculated cover-up. Medical experts testified that Christian's injuries could not have been accidental. The force required to cause skull fractures in a healthy 4-year-old requires intentional violence. The multiple injury sites indicated a sustained attack, not a single accident. Arson experts explained the fire patterns and accelerant use, making clear this was not a cooking accident or electrical fire, but a deliberately set blaze designed to destroy evidence. Digital forensics specialists presented Nicole's online search history, showing her research into fires and concealing injuries, searches that demonstrated premeditation and consciousness of guilt. Perhaps most damning was Nicole's own behavior. Her changing stories, her delay in reporting Christian was in the house, her lack of visible emotion or grief, all suggested someone trying to escape consequences rather than a devastated mother who had lost her child. In December 2015, after several days of deliberation, the jury convicted Nicole Diar on all counts: aggravated murder, arson, and tampering with evidence. At sentencing in February 2016, the judge delivered harsh words. "You took the life of your own 4-year-old son, a child who depended on you for everything. Then you tried to burn his body to hide your crime. The cruelty and calculation of your actions warrant the maximum punishment allowed by law." Nicole Diar was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the aggravated murder conviction, with additional concurrent sentences for the other charges. She will spend the rest of her life behind bars. Christian Diar's paternal grandparents, who had been seeking increased visitation at the time of his death, delivered tearful victim impact statements. They described a joyful little boy who loved dinosaurs and trucks, who gave the best hugs, who lit up every room he entered. They expressed anguish at not being able to protect him and rage at Nicole for stealing his future. Christian was buried in a small cemetery in Lorain County. His grave is marked with a headstone featuring a carved teddy bear and the inscription, "Forever for," forever loved, forever missed. The community rallied around Christian's memory, holding vigils and establishing a foundation to support other children at risk. Christian's death became a catalyst for increased awareness about child abuse prevention and the importance of intervention. Nicole Diar remains incarcerated at the Ohio Reformatory for Women, where she will remain for the rest of her natural life. She has reportedly shown little remorse, according to prison officials, spending her time in relative isolation from other inmates, many of whom view crimes against children as particularly heinous even within the prison population. This final case in our examination of Ohio's most evil mothers exemplifies the extreme lengths some will go to hide their crimes. Nicole didn't just kill her son, she tried to obliterate the evidence of his very existence through fire. But Christian Diar existed. He mattered. He had value and potential and a right to life that his mother stole from him. Child abuse often escalates in private, behind closed doors. But warning signs are almost always visible to observant outsiders. Unexplained injuries, withdrawn behavior, frequent absences, signs of malnutrition or neglect. These indicators should prompt action. If you see these signs, report them. If your first report doesn't result in intervention, report again. Document what you observe. Be persistent. Be thorough. Be the person who refuses to look away when a child needs help. Christian Diar needed someone to look more closely at those bruises, to ask harder questions, to insist on investigation. Be that person for the next child. Your vigilance, your courage, your refusal to accept convenient explanations could save a life. Conclusion. We've examined 10 cases of mothers who murdered their children in Ohio. 10 innocent children whose lives were stolen by the people who should have protected them. 10 families devastated by unimaginable loss. 10 communities forced to confront the darkest aspects of human nature. These cases span different circumstances and different methods, but they share common threads: violence against the defenseless, betrayal of fundamental trust, and preventable tragedies that slipped through cracks in our social safety systems. Kristel Candelario left her baby to die alone over 10 days so she could vacation. China Arnold microwaved her infant daughter. Tiffany Hawkins beat her toddler to death. Ruth Miller drowned her son while experiencing psychotic delusions. Daisha Summers inflicted fatal blunt force trauma on her 10-month-old. Anjelica Stewart attempted to drown all 3 of her children. Amanda Bunner murdered her 2-year-old son through sustained abuse. Lashanda Wilder killed her son and hid his body in the attic for months. Timmeka Eggleton allowed her girlfriend to torture her daughter to death. And Nicole Diar beat her 4-year-old to death and set fire to his body. These are not aberrations or anomalies. These are real crimes that happened in real communities across Ohio within the last decade. They represent failures of individuals, certainly, but also failures of systems, communities, and support networks. What can we learn from these tragedies? First, we must recognize that mental illness, substance abuse, domestic violence, and poverty are risk factors for child abuse and neglect. We need better screening, earlier intervention, and more comprehensive support for struggling families. Resources exist, but they're often underfunded, difficult to access, or stigmatized. Second, we must empower and expect community members to report suspected abuse. Teachers, neighbors, relatives, doctors, coaches, anyone who interacts with children can be a crucial safety net. But reporting alone isn't enough. Child Protective Services need adequate resources to investigate thoroughly and follow up consistently. Third, we must address the cultural hesitation to intervene in family matters. Privacy is important, but it cannot be an excuse for allowing children to suffer and die behind closed doors. When we see warning signs, we must act. When our initial concerns aren't addressed adequately, we must persist. Fourth, we need honest conversations about the challenges of parenthood and the reality that not everyone who becomes a parent is capable of providing adequate care. We need accessible options for struggling parents: respite care, counseling, financial assistance, even safe surrender options for parents who cannot or will not care for their children. Finally, we must remember the victims. These cases aren't just about evil mothers or systemic failures. They're about children, real children with names, personalities, potential, and value. They're about Jalen, Paris, Miana, Jeremiah, Zariah, 3 Stewart children who survived: Zachary, Jonathan, Ania, and Christian. These children deserved better. They deserved mothers who loved them, protected them, and nurtured them. They deserved communities that watched out for them. They deserved systems that worked to keep them safe. Instead, they got pain, fear, and death. We cannot bring them back. But we can honor their memories by committing to do better, by being more vigilant, more compassionate, more willing to intervene when children are at risk. We can support struggling parents before desperation turns to violence. We can believe children when they show us signs of abuse. We can demand better from our child welfare systems and hold them accountable when they fail. Every child deserves safety, love, and the opportunity to grow up. When we fail to provide that, we all bear some responsibility. But when we succeed in protecting even one child from harm, we honor the memories of those we lost. If this episode has affected you, please seek support. If you are struggling as a parent, please reach out for help. If you suspect a child is being abused, please make a report. Thank you for watching this difficult but necessary episode of Cold Case Hour. These stories need to be told, these victims need to be remembered, and these tragedies need to be prevented from happening again. If you found this content valuable, please like this video. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts or your own experiences with child welfare issues. And please hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode of Cold Case Hour, where we examine the cases that shaped our communities and the lessons we must learn from them. Remember, awareness prevents tragedy. Vigilance saves lives. And every child deserves an advocate. Until next time, stay informed, stay compassionate, and stay committed to protecting the most vulnerable among us. This has been Cold Case Hour.